David Rivers stepped onto the jet bridge like hundreds of passengers before him, quiet, unassuming. He wore a black cotton sweatshirt, worn jeans and sneakers that spoke not of status, but comfort. He didn't wear the uniform of power. He didn't flaunt it. He embodied it. The first-class cabin was already alive with the rustle of newspapers, the clink of glassware, and polite conversation. Everything flowed predictably, smoothly, on schedule. Until he took his seat. Carla Dawson, the lead flight attendant on duty, held her gaze just a second too long enough to pass silent judgment. Her second glance was at the man, the third at his clothes, never at his boarding pass. A subtle nod to her colleague followed, Zach Morgan, young, confident, sharp-tongued. He didn't approach with curiosity, but certainty, and with bias. The system had confirmed boarding. The scan was green. His ID was flawless. But instead of recognition came interference. On her tablet, his name vanished. The seat was suddenly assigned an error. The air around David seemed to compress. Lena Torres, a trainee with a proud posture and uncertain steps, stood near the back of the cabin. She had seen the scan validate. She'd overheard comments about the look of the passenger. She could feel it. In the hush of the aisle, something had gone loudly wrong. Olivia Bennett, a third-row passenger, only saw the result. Confusion in one man's eyes, calm predation in the crew's motions. She started filming. James Cole, beside her, was already posting. The picture was too clear to ignore. David didn't argue. He didn't try to prove anything. He simply looked ahead, pulled out his phone, and made one call. Everything changed in that moment. The entire scene felt like a frame from a drama where the truth hides in the details, in altered logs, in cold glances, in wiped digital trails. Some watched passively. Others captured every second. David Rivers hadn't simply taken a first-class seat. He'd entered the system to see how it would behave when no one knew who he was. And that system failed, spectacularly. What began as a test became an investigation. And before takeoff, the airplane became a courtroom, where the unseen rules of prejudice were laid bare. The moment David Rivers sat down in seat 2A, the dynamic within the cabin shifted. It wasn't immediate, nor dramatic, but like a cold front drifting in, subtle, yet undeniable. What began as routine boarding quickly morphed into something else entirely. The crew's behavior changed first. Carla Dawson, sharp-eyed and methodical, reacted not with greeting, but with skepticism. She assessed David not by his credentials, but by his clothes, his posture, his anonymity. She didn't need confirmation from a manifest. Her judgment was swift, and it was final. Zach Morgan joined her with a casual air, reinforcing her unspoken assumptions. Where Carla moved with command, Zach added mockery. Together, their actions formed a quiet choreography of exclusion. The tablet screen showed a valid boarding, but within minutes, that truth vanished. David's name disappeared from the digital manifest. The screen no longer confirmed his presence. The seat was now listed as reassigned. An error. Except Lena Torres saw everything. She watched the scan go green. She noticed the shift in body language, the coded glances exchanged between crew members. She listened as they whispered about David's appearance, how he didn't fit their image of a first-class traveler. Young and untested, Lena hesitated, but instinct overrode inexperience. She tapped record. Around them, a few passengers began to sense the discord. Olivia Bennett, seated nearby, noted the shift in tone. James Cole, more attuned than most, started filming before anyone else moved. It wasn't outrage that spurred them at first, but recognition, a pattern forming, familiar and uncomfortable. Captain Eric Wallace entered like a gavel strike. No questions, just declarations. His confidence wasn't rooted in investigation, but in hierarchy. Authority, misapplied, can mask bias with alarming efficiency. He accepted the crew's version without pause. The reassigned passengers, Victor and Sophie Langley, arrived with the calm entitlement of those who never have to question why things go their way. They took their places. They didn't ask. They didn't look around. They simply benefited. Meanwhile, the cabin itself began to shift. A ripple of discomfort spread. Phones emerged. Glances were exchanged. The silence that discrimination often thrives in began to fray. David didn't resist. He observed. He listened. And then he acted, not with confrontation, but with precision. The narrative had been set. Now, it was being recorded. It started as a single decision, to ignore a boarding pass. But systems don't collapse from one failure. They collapse from the chain reaction that follows when no one stops it. David Rivers was still in seat 1A. The crew had moved on, or tried to. Carla Dawson resumed her tasks with measured professionalism. Zach Morgan adjusted trays and offered smiles. But beneath their routine, there was a quiet scramble. Something had slipped. They felt it. They just didn't yet understand the scale. Lena Torres understood. Her phone remained recording, discreet in her jacket pocket. She hadn't been told to intervene, but she knew she was watching a policy mutate into discrimination. The crew had overridden confirmation. They had invalidated a paid, verified passenger based on visual judgment, then erased the evidence. Except it wasn't erased. Not really. Passenger videos were already circling online. Olivia Bennett's footage had made it to several viral Twitter accounts. James Cole had uploaded a clip that was now cross-posted on 3 platforms. Together, they showed the full sequence: the ignored scan, the dismissive tone, the deletion from the tablet log, no edits, no commentary, just facts, and the facts were damning. The Altura Air Control Center in New York had picked up the trending alert. Nina Brooks had already moved. She wasn't filing complaints. She was compiling proof. Every internal communication from the Zurich gate crew to the flight staff was being pulled into a single chain. Timestamps, keystroke logs, badge scans, all matched. The deletion wasn't an accident. It had a fingerprint. Carla didn't know her actions had already entered a legal review folder. Zach didn't know the audio of his comments was now being slowed, transcribed, and time-coded by 3 different viewers. Captain Wallace remained in the cockpit. He hadn't left his seat since signing the final incident report, but the terms he'd used, non-compliance, seat reassignment, refusal to follow instruction, were now appearing in news comment threads alongside side-by-side passenger footage showing otherwise. The plane hadn't pushed back, not because of air traffic, because the airline couldn't decide what was worse: taking off with a viral incident in motion or delaying and risking more scrutiny. And David, he remained quiet. Because the point had already been made. This wasn't a mistake in customer service. This was what happens when authority isn't questioned, when bias is normalized, when decisions aren't double-checked. Now, they weren't just dealing with a passenger, they were facing a case study. And it was being written live. By 5:12 p.m. Zurich time, the aircraft remained idle at the gate. There was no technical delay, no security incident, no missing crew. The only variable was seat 1A, and the fallout now unfolding around it. David Rivers hadn't spoken, not a single word. But his silence had become the focal point of the entire flight. What the crew assumed would be a minor disruption was now a full-blown corporate liability, broadcast in real time. Carla Dawson attempted to maintain order. Her voice remained even, her smile intact, but her authority was fraying. She hadn't just enforced a misjudgment, she'd formalized it. The deletion of David's name from the digital manifest wasn't a glitch. It was a manual override, traceable, time-stamped, linked to her login. Zach Morgan, who had once dismissed David with a sarcastic grin, now kept to the galley. The confidence was gone. He avoided the aisle. Passengers weren't speaking to him, but they were watching him. Lena Torres stood still, arms crossed. Her phone remained in record mode, tucked inside her blazer. She wasn't sure what would happen next, only that her recording might matter more than her silence. Her instinct had been right. Something wrong had happened, and now it was becoming undeniable. Olivia Bennett posted again, a close-up clip of David sitting in seat 1A. Caption: "Still here, still silent, still erased." James Cole reposted it with a new edit, a side-by-side showing the scan light turning green, followed by the moment David's name disappeared from the tablet. That footage was being cited in the first press articles within minutes. In the cockpit, Captain Wallace reviewed a short statement prepared by corporate. A seat assignment discrepancy is being resolved prior to departure. But legal had already advised against using it. Too vague. Too late. The footage had already disproven the narrative. At headquarters, Nina Brooks continued assembling the full evidence packet. All 5 camera angles from the gate. Internal communication between the Zurich crew and Altura's dispatch. Device logs showing the deletion time. The system was built for traceability. Now it was tracing the truth back to the people who tried to bury it. HR flagged Carla and Zach's records, past complaints, informal warnings, small moments previously overlooked, now recontextualized. No one on board had said the word lawsuit yet, but no one needed to. Flight 894 remained sealed. The air was still. Passengers waited. Crew waited. The timeline couldn't move forward until the airline acknowledged what had already been witnessed. David Rivers didn't need to speak. He was surrounded by proof. At 5:19 p.m., Zurich time, Flight 894 remained motionless on the tarmac, not due to weather, not mechanical, not crew scheduling. The delay was administrative and unresolvable from inside the cabin. David Rivers had not moved. His phone rested on the tray table. The only message he'd sent was a timestamp to Nina Brooks. Nothing else. No demands, no threats. Just a marker. The exact second the boarding pass was torn, the screen wiped, the assumption made. In New York, Nina didn't explain. She presented. Her file structure was clear. Internal logs, passenger videos, crew history, real-time response. Every piece of the incident mapped, layered, and time-stamped. The board didn't need speculation. They needed precision, and that's what they got. Meanwhile, on the aircraft, the atmosphere had curdled. Carla Dawson received the formal instruction through crew messaging. Suspend further engagement. Await compliance review. Her badge access was quietly downgraded in the back end. She could walk the aisle, but not the gate. Zach Morgan had already received a call. His shift wasn't extended. It was terminated mid-flight. He didn't announce it, but he knew. And Lena Torres saw the message appear on his device, a red flag in a sea of default notifications. Lena remained silent, her phone still recording. Not because she feared forgetting, but because truth now required evidence. She had captured the moment, and that moment had already left the aircraft. James Cole's edit had gone mainstream. Olivia Bennett was contacted by 3 major outlets. The narrative was stable, consistent, and unshakable. No ambiguity. A founder of the airline had been publicly removed from his seat by his own crew. Every part of it filmed. Every attempt at misdirection time-stamped and contradicted. There was nothing left to debate. Back in headquarters, one director asked a final question. "Do we have any statement ready for press?" Nina replied without hesitation. "Not yet. David hasn't spoken." That silence carried weight, because it meant nothing was being negotiated, no reputational reset, no soft internal memo. This wasn't a media issue. It was a failure of culture, and culture doesn't get patched overnight. The passengers didn't know the full scope, but they could feel it. The delay, the tension, the absence of announcements, all signs that the problem wasn't in the air. It was in the mirror. Flight 894 would depart eventually, but Altura Air's image had already arrived, where it didn't want to be. Flight 894 landed at JFK at 9:27 p.m. EST. The arrival was logged without incident. No report was filed on board. No further conflict was noted. But the data told a different story. By the time the aircraft reached the gate, Altura Air's reputation had already been redefined. David Rivers exited the plane last. No entourage, no comment, no reaction. His presence was quiet. But the footprint of what happened followed him into every meeting, memo, and policy review from that day forward. Corporate response began before the cabin doors even opened. Legal initiated a full incident reconstruction. The boarding pass deletion log was traced to Carla Dawson's device. The confirmation override came from Zach Morgan's account. Both systems were flagged and quarantined for investigation. Lena Torres's recording was authenticated and time-stamped. Olivia Bennett's footage was archived under case file A8941A. James Cole's social media activity was tracked in parallel by 3 media analysts. Combined, they created a clean public timeline, uninterrupted, unedited, and undeniable. David provided no input. He didn't need to. Altura's executive team knew the stakes. An informal board meeting turned formal. HR disciplinary hearings were expedited. 3 managers were demoted. 1 was removed. Compliance training was rewritten. For the first time, policy language was changed, not in aspiration, but in response to consequence. Press inquiries were initially deflected. We are reviewing the incident internally. We take all customer concerns seriously. But those words failed to hold in the face of synced video, public analysis, and mounting shareholder concern. By morning, the company stock had dipped 3.4%. David made no statement to the media, but behind closed doors he did speak, to the board, a single directive. You don't need to protect my image. You need to protect the next person who doesn't have one. The room was silent. Then the changes began. Altura grounded 2 crews pending review. They launched a third-party bias audit across their premium service tiers. A new system for anonymous reporting was installed within the week. Flight 894 would appear in annual compliance training modules, not because of a policy breach, but because it proved that systems fail not just when rules are broken, but when assumptions are enforced instead of facts. David Rivers walked away from that flight without fanfare. But the airline wouldn't walk away from him. Not ever again. David Rivers didn't need to speak. His presence had done the work. Every choice he made, from sitting in silence to refusing confrontation, had been calculated, not for optics, but for outcome. He hadn't boarded Flight 894 to be recognized. He boarded to observe. And what he witnessed was not an anomaly. It was a routine mistake performed with confidence by a team convinced they were following protocol. That was the problem. They weren't operating off written policy. They were guided by perception, and perception, when unchecked, becomes prejudice. He didn't document it. Others did. He didn't escalate. The system did that on its own. What mattered to him was how quickly the facade fell apart under scrutiny. Not just the crew, but the tools they used. The app that allowed deletion without verification. The training that never taught second chances. The silence of bystanders. It was all part of the mechanism. And it was that mechanism he intended to expose. Not for punishment, for precision. Because leadership, in his view, wasn't about appearing strong. It was about ensuring that weakness in the system couldn't hide under uniforms or policies. Back at headquarters, the cleanup had already begun. But David wasn't interested in headlines or apologies. What he wanted was measurement. How long until bias was acknowledged in operations reports? How fast could technology be restructured to remove discretion where it wasn't earned? His team wouldn't need to guess. They'd already started building the internal review architecture the night of the flight. Quietly, methodically, just like he planned. He didn't want a scandal. He wanted a benchmark. a visible public failure that would force the next generation of protocols to account for human error before it reached a gate. That flight wasn't a breakdown, it was a blueprint, and now that it was complete, he stepped back, letting the evidence speak, letting reform take root. Not because of pressure, but because of design. And in the end, that was his role. Not a passenger, not a symbol, an architect, testing the system he helped build to see if it could still evolve. Now it would. Flight 894 didn't become a headline because of conflict. It became a lesson because someone chose not to walk away. David Rivers showed that sometimes change begins by refusing to disappear. This is a fictional story. If you found something meaningful in this story, subscribe for more. Like the video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and help us keep telling stories that stay with you long after they end.